Okay, let's unpack this. We are undertaking a deep dive into a case that grabbed global headlines for its shocking nature and it's just bizarre details. The 2014 slaying of Sheila von Mack, who was murdered while on vacation in Bali, Indonesia. This is a story of wealth, of chronic domestic violence, and a conspiracy that spanned thousands of miles, culminating in a tragedy involving her own daughter, Heather Mack, and her boyfriend, Tommy Schaefer.
And what makes this investigation truly unique for you, the listener, is really the sheer complexity of the legal consequences that followed. We're looking at a tragedy that was, defined by years of documented domestic turmoil and these intense financial disputes that all culminated in a crime overseas. The immediate shock an American mother found stuffed into a suitcase, that was just the beginning. What followed were years of legal wrangling that resulted not just in convictions in Indonesia, but a rare and really critical subsequent federal conviction here in the United States. We have to acknowledge the profound tragic circumstances surrounding the victim, Sheila von Mack, whose life ended so violently and so very far from home.
That dual conviction process, I mean, one overseas and one domestically for essentially the same act, that is highly unusual. It really demands a thorough investigation of the sources. So our mission today is to synthesize a vast and comprehensive body of material. We have to navigate the deep, troubled family history documented by all these police reports, dissect the details of the crime, the deception used to execute it. Then we have to analyze the complex dynamics of the Indonesian trial and the associated financial drama involving the family trust fund. And finally, trace the path of the subsequent U.S. federal conspiracy case that led to Heather Mack receiving that 26-year sentence earlier this year. It's a long journey across two continents and two very distinct legal systems. To really understand the catastrophic act in Bali, we absolutely must establish the profound friction that preceded it. This was not a crime that just materialized out of nowhere. The source material paints a continuous, escalating picture of conflict that lasted for years.
That foundational context is absolutely essential. So we start with the family unit. You have Sheila Ann von Weiss, born in 1952, who was married to James L. Mack, a respected jazz musician and composer, born back in 1929. Their daughter, Heather Lois Mack, was born in 1995. And the sources confirm that Heather and her future co-conspirator, Tommy Schaefer, they shared a background. They both attended Oak Park and River Forest High School in Illinois. So that relationship, it was formed long before the events of 2014.
And it seems like the family stability was really profoundly altered by an event in 2001, an event that then entangled the family finances in years and years of litigation.
Precisely. In 2001, James L. Mack suffered a significant foot injury during a Royal Caribbean Mediterranean cruise. The crucial element here, according to all the sources, is that he did not receive adequate medical treatment from the ship's doctor. This failure in care, it ultimately resulted in partial paralysis. And this trauma led to James Mack filing a substantial lawsuit against Royal Caribbean. It was a complex civil case that would just drag on for half a decade.
And tragically, he passed away before that lawsuit was even resolved.
Yes. In 2006, James L. Mack died in Greece from a pulmonary embolism. His death occurred while the litigation was still pending, which means the settlement, which would eventually define the whole financial backdrop to the murder, was finalized years later under Sheila's control.
So what happened with the estate and the settlement proceeds? This seems to be the very origin of the financial resentment that Heather harbored toward her mother.
It became an incredibly convoluted legal situation. The Royal Caribbean lawsuit settlement was finally reached in 2011. After legal fees were deducted, the net result was that $340,667 was awarded directly to Sheila Mack, and a separate $500,000 portion was designated for the estate of James Mack. And here's the absolute crux of the conflict. James L. Mack had executed a will just 5 days before his death, willing his entire estate to his then-young daughter, Heather Mack.
But the sources state that a judge in Cook County, Illinois, overrode that intent. The judge awarded the $500,000 portion designated for the estate to Sheila Mack. That's the legal mechanism that immediately altered the intended inheritance.
That is the pivotal moment. It fundamentally changed everything for Heather. Her future expectations, Sheila's immediate control over the money. Now, the source material explicitly notes that no transcript for that specific Cook County case is available, so we have to speculate a bit. But you have to consider the legal possibilities. Why would a judge override a recent will? I mean, potential reasons could involve the will being legally challenged as flawed. Maybe the judge prioritized spousal support over a minor beneficiary's inheritance under probate law. Or perhaps there were prenuptial agreements related to the handling of newly acquired assets, like lawsuit settlements. Regardless of the technical legal reason, the outcome was devastatingly simple for Heather. $500,000 she expected to get suddenly fell under her mother's complete control. and that created a clear, documented financial grievance.
So that legal maneuver created these intense financial grounds for contention. But the documented conflict goes so far beyond money. The police records establish a pattern of domestic violence that is, frankly, horrifying in its volume.
The sheer number of interventions is just staggering. It reflects a decade-long crisis that the authorities were repeatedly called to manage, but, never resolved. Police were called to the Mack family home, a documented total of 86 times.
86.
Between 2004 and June 2013. And every single one of these calls related to domestic incidents between mother and daughter, including reports of theft, property damage, and repeated, very serious domestic violence.
86 calls over 9 years. That highlights an acutely volatile and, critically, a dangerous environment. For you, the listener, that's almost one police call every 5 weeks for 9 straight years. What details from the sources illustrate the escalating nature of this violence and control?
The police files detail a really disturbing pattern of control and physical assault. We have specific, grim examples. In January 2010, the sources report that Heather allegedly punched her mother's already broken ankle.
A broken ankle.
Yes. And on top of that, was also accused of stealing $1,000. This combination of physical violence and theft. It suggests an environment just lacking any boundary or respect.
And the escalation continued, moving toward tactics of isolation.
Absolutely. In February 2011, the violence escalated dramatically. Heather reportedly broke her mother's arm, and crucially, she then removed the phone cord to prevent Sheila from calling 911. It showcases an active strategy to prevent the victim from seeking any external aid or medical attention.
That indicates, premeditated control, not just a spontaneous fit of rage.
Exactly. And later, we see continued physical violence even after police intervention. In November 2012, there was a report that Heather bit her mother, leaving a bruise. And the sources note that Sheila, despite the visible injury, refused to allow the police to photograph it.
That pattern, the violence continuing, followed by the victim's reluctance to cooperate fully with law enforcement, is often typical in these long-standing cycles of domestic abuse. It indicates fear or maybe a desperate attempt to just manage the situation internally.
And while this long-standing conflict was active, the relationship between Heather Mack and Tommy Schaefer began. That introduced a third element into this already volatile dynamic.
Right. So Heather started dating Tommy Schaefer, who the sources describe as an unemployed rapper while she was a senior in high school. And Sheila's disapproval was intense, so intense that she took drastic action to end the relationship. She sold their house and moved herself and Heather to the high-end Gold Coast neighborhood of Chicago, specifically intending to separate them and sever that relationship.
But that effort failed. And the sources indicate the stakes rose dramatically when Heather became pregnant by Tommy, despite her mother's attempts to isolate them.
The pregnancy, it seems like it brought the already volatile situation to a dangerous peak, at least according to claims made by Heather's lawyer after the crime.
Yes, the lawyer asserted that this was not the first time. Heather had allegedly already undergone 2 abortions under her mother's direct control. Furthermore, the claim was that Sheila was actively seeking to obtain power of attorney over her daughter just before the Bali trip was booked, with the explicit goal of enforcing a 3rd abortion. When they left for Bali, Sheila was reportedly awaiting blood work to confirm the pregnancy, which shows you just how impending that confrontation was.
Okay, so if we synthesize this picture for the listener, on the eve of this international trip, we have a financial grievance dating all the way back to the father's estate. We have 86 documented police calls reflecting a decade of physical abuse and control, and an immediate high-stakes disagreement over the pregnancy, with the mother allegedly attempting to exert absolute control through legal means. This is the powder keg that was transported to Bali. Let's transition now to August 2014 and the trip itself. Sheila and Heather traveled first class to Indonesia, checking into the opulent St. Regis Hotel in Nusa Dua. It was meant to project an image of luxury and normalcy, but it was really masking the severe discord.
Indeed, it was a costly attempt at a facade. The sources clearly established that the planning for the crime, or at least the conspiracy, began almost immediately upon arrival. Heather committed the first act of financial deceit. She stole her mother's credit card, and she used it to book a business-class flight for Tommy Schaefer to join them in Bali. This fraudulent action demonstrates that Schaefer's presence was arranged by Heather and was, financially motivated right from the start.
So Schaefer arrives, and his later claims about why he was there, they prove to be entirely manufactured.
That's correct. Tommy initially claimed he traveled to Bali merely to tell Sheila about Heather's pregnancy. It was an explanation designed to make the confrontation sound accidental, like something that just happened. However, emails and communication records released later contradicted this entirely. They indicated his presence was premeditated and part of a larger planned strategy.
The actual murder took place on the night of August 7, 2014. What exactly did the sources reveal about the final hours and the act itself?
The hotel's security cameras provided chilling, crucial evidence. Video footage captured Sheila arguing intensely with Schaefer in the hotel lobby on the evening of the 7th. So this public confrontation established that the tension had immediate external visibility. And then shortly after that argument, the sources confirm the murder took place up in their hotel room. The method was brutal. Tommy Schaefer killed Sheila using a metallic blunt object.
And the immediate aftermath was the act that shocked the world? The use of the suitcase?
The choice of concealment was gruesome and, frankly, highly impractical. Following the murder, Heather and Tommy worked together, stuffing the body of Sheila von Wismack into a large suitcase. They then transported the suitcase and placed it into the trunk of a waiting taxi outside the St. Regis Hotel.
They loaded the evidence, but then just bizarrely walked away, leaving the cab driver just sitting there. What led to the immediate discovery?
It was an act of extreme negligence and the vigilance of the hotel staff. The sources state that the couple put the suitcase in the trunk. They told the driver to wait, but then they just failed to return. The driver waited for hours. It was during this wait that a sharp-eyed security guard became suspicious. He noticed blood beginning to seep outside the suitcase and staining the trunk.
Oh, wow.
The security guard immediately advised the cab driver to abandon the wait and proceed directly to the police station.
That swift action by the security guard was absolutely critical in freezing the scene and initiating the investigation immediately.
It was absolutely key. Once the police found the body inside the suitcase, the search for the pair intensified. Mack and Schaefer were quickly apprehended at a nearby budget motel. Their attempt to cover up the crime involved this clumsy lie to the police. They claimed Sheila had been killed by robbers, and they were lucky to have escaped. But that fabricated story, it just quickly disintegrated as the evidence, especially the security footage and the stolen credit card transaction, all started to accumulate.
So with the couple detained, the legal process began in Indonesia, a jurisdiction known for very serious penalties, including the death penalty by firing squad for premeditated murder.
The process began swiftly. Within days, by August 15, 2014, Mack and Schaefer were formally designated as prisoners. A major mitigating factor emerged very early on: Heather Mack's pregnancy. A urine test on August 20th confirmed she was pregnant. It's worth noting that the sources indicate this pregnancy was initially viewed with some suspicion. Some speculated it was a potential ruse to facilitate her being released or sent back to the United States.
Despite any of those initial suspicions, the pair eventually did confess their involvement.
Yes. On September 19th, Schaefer admitted to the killing, but he claimed self-defense in the moment. Heather Mack also confessed to her role, specifically admitting to helping him stuff the body into the suitcase after the fact. Despite these limited confessions, they were formally charged with the capital offense of premeditated murder on January 14th, 2015.
During the trial, Schaefer presented a defense that attempted to shift the narrative of who initiated the violence in the hotel room.
Schaefer's defense was crucial for the Indonesian court's final sentencing decision. He claimed he killed Sheila von Wismack only after she had threatened to kill their unborn baby. And furthermore, he alleged that she had physically attacked him first, choking him for roughly half a minute, leading him to lash out in a moment of panic.
Given the documented decade-long history of physical violence perpetrated by Heather, how seriously did the Indonesian court regard Schaefer's specific claim that Sheila was the physical aggressor in that final moment?
That's a critical question regarding the sources on the Indonesian trial. While the court acknowledged Sheila's volatility and the history of conflict, the judges ultimately accepted Schaefer's claim of self-defense in the context of protecting the unborn child as a mitigating factor. They didn't dismiss the murder as entirely premeditated or purely financially motivated. The judge's decision suggested they saw the event as, partially rooted in a spontaneous escalation, even though the charge remained premeditated murder.
The resulting sentences were surprisingly lenient, especially for Heather Mack, given the premeditation charge and the potential for the death penalty.
They were remarkably lenient. In April 2015, Tommy Schaefer was sentenced to 18 years in prison. Heather Mack received a significantly shorter sentence of 10 years. For the listener, the reason for this leniency is documented and highly specific. The judges explicitly stated their rationale for going easier on Heather Mack was because she had given birth to their daughter, Estelle Stella Schaefer, on March 17, 2015, while in custody. The preservation of the child's well-being was treated as a major mitigating factor under Indonesian justice philosophy.
So the birth of her daughter directly reduced the time she served. But while the Indonesian trial was focused on the act of murder, the U.S. authorities were developing a separate case focused on the conspiracy element, the part that occurred back in the U.S.
And this is where the narrative splits, and the U.S. federal government enters the picture. On September 23, 2015, Tommy Schaefer's cousin, Robert Bibbs, was arrested in Chicago and faced federal charges for conspiracy. This immediately validated the idea that the Bali murder was not an isolated act, but a coordinated, planned crime originating right here in the United States.
Bibbs wasn't physically present in Bali, so his involvement must have been purely advisory or organizational. What exactly did the U.S. federal indictment and his subsequent plea deal reveal about the depth of his role?
The sources detail his role precisely, and they link him directly to the financial motive and the method of the killing. Bibbs admitted in his plea deal that he was fully aware that Heather Mack had offered Tommy Schaefer $50,000 to kill her mother. And furthermore, the federal indictment showed he actively advised Schaefer on how to carry out the murder and enthusiastically encouraged him to do it.
Can we elaborate on the nature of that communication? What specific advice was Bibbs giving that transformed him from just a bystander into a convicted conspirator?
The federal authorities used communications, we're talking likely detailed texts, emails, or monitored calls, to establish the necessary link. The sources suggest Bibbs provided specific guidance on aspects like timing, maybe recommending methods of attack or disposal, and he continually reinforced the idea of the financial reward, essentially, overriding any moral hesitation Schaefer might have had. This evidence was sufficient to convict him not just of being aware, but of actively facilitating and encouraging the foreign murder.
And what was the outcome of the U.S. federal case against Robert Bibbs?
Robert Bibbs was sentenced to 9 years in prison on June 6, 2017, for one count of conspiracy to commit foreign murder. His conviction was the first domino to fall in the U.S. federal prosecution strategy, and it laid the essential legal groundwork for the subsequent, more significant case against Heather Mack herself.
The specter of Sheila von Weizsäck's wealth, specifically the inheritance, it fueled the conspiracy, and it continued to complicate the legal processes in both Indonesia and the U.S. Let's focus on the structure of that trust fund.
So the victim, Sheila von Weizsäck, had established a trust fund from which her daughter Heather was the primary beneficiary. The value was approximately $1.6 million, and the structure of this trust was very deliberate. It stipulated that Heather would receive relatively small annual payments. It was designed perhaps to prevent her from quickly squandering the funds. The balance would be paid out as a lump sum only when she reached the age of 30. This deferred access was a form of control, which, given the history, makes a lot of sense.
While Mack was imprisoned in Indonesia, there were immediate legal battles concerning the use of this fund for her defense.
Absolutely. Initially, the Illinois probate court supervising the trust approved an allocation of up to $150,000 to cover her legal fees during the Indonesian trial. Smaller payments were also approved for basic necessities while she was incarcerated. However, this access quickly generated suspicion among family members who were managing the estate.
What specifically raised concerns regarding the use of the trust money in Indonesia?
The administrator of the estate was Sheila's brother, Bill Wise. He was the one who voiced deep, serious concern to the U.S. courts. His suspicion arose when Mack's Indonesian lawyer suddenly demanded a substantial further payment, a $200,000 lump sum. Wise expressed his concern that the money being accessed from the trust was not strictly going toward legitimate legal defense, but in his view was possibly being used to cover bribes.
Bribes?
Bribes related to the trial proceedings in the Indonesian justice system, which has been known for corruption issues.
That is a highly charged accusation. It could potentially impact the legitimacy of the Indonesian sentencing. Did the U.S. courts investigate this specific bribery claim, or was it just left as an open legal concern?
The sources suggest this specific aspect remains more of a cloud over the financial documentation rather than a resolved legal finding. The U.S. courts handling the trust, which were focused on the disposition of Sheila's assets, were forced to deal with the administrator's claims of improper expenditure. Bill Wise had to detail his concerns in his petitions to the court. While the court did halt further large payments, the documentation doesn't confirm a formal U.S. investigation into the alleged Indonesian bribery itself. So it's left as a documented suspicion that heavily influenced the administrator's actions going forward.
Given the gravity of the crime and the clear financial motive, it seems the family sought to ensure Heather Mack, as the convicted murderer, would not ultimately profit from her mother's death. How was this financial dispute finally resolved?
It took several years of intense legal maneuvering in the U.S. The final disposition of the $1.6 million trust fund was resolved through a settlement that was reached in 2018. The outcome was definitive and strategically sound. The vast majority of the settlement was made in favor of Mack's daughter, Stella Schaefer, who was, legally, the victim's granddaughter and a completely innocent party in all of this.
How was that legally structured to prevent Heather Mack from accessing the funds when Stella was still a minor, or even when Mack was eventually released?
The core mechanism involved restructuring the assets into a separate protective trust for Stella. The U.S. court had to ensure that the funds were protected under what's called the Slayer Rule, which prevents a murderer from inheriting directly from their victim. By diverting the assets to Stella, the court satisfied both the legal obligation to the victim's family and ensured the funds were used for the benefit of the granddaughter. But critically, it kept the principal entirely out of Heather Mack's direct control upon her eventual release from prison. It was a successful strategy to neutralize the financial motive retrospectively.
Now we track the final stages of the legal journey. Heather Mack's release from the Indonesian prison, which marked the end of one sentence, and her immediate rearrest in the U.S., which marked the beginning of the next.
Mack served 7 years of her 10-year sentence in Indonesia. The reason she served less than the full term was due to significant sentence remission, totaling 34 months. This is a common practice in Indonesia. For you, the listener, remission involves reductions granted for good behavior and special holidays. Critically, the sources note that this total included a 6-month Independence Day remission, specifically awarded by President Joko Widodo in August 2021.
So she was officially released from prison on October 29, 2021. What were her immediate plans, and why did Indonesian authorities intervene?
Mack initially stated a strong desire to stay in Indonesia with her daughter. She even claimed she believed it was safer there than returning to Chicago. However, the Indonesian immigration authorities immediately intervened. They made it very clear that both she and her American-born daughter would be deported immediately. This decision was governed by Indonesia's jus sanguinis, or right of blood nationality law. Since Stella was born to American parents, she could not claim Indonesian citizenship, and therefore they were both subject to deportation.
And the U.S. federal government was just waiting for her arrival, fully prepared to start their own prosecution immediately.
Yes. The moment she arrived back in the United States, Heather Mack was arrested by federal authorities. The charges were serious and stemmed directly from the murder and the pre-planning, conspiracy to commit murder of a U.S. national and obstruction. The federal government, having already secured a conviction against co-conspirator Robert Bibbs, had spent years building the case to prosecute her for orchestrating the crime on U.S. soil.
This brings us to the core legal question. She was already convicted and served time for this crime in Indonesia. So how can the U.S. federal government legally prosecute her for the same set of facts without violating principles of double jeopardy?
This is where it gets into high-level legal analysis, and it's a critical distinction for this case. The U.S. federal government was able to pursue this case successfully because of something called the separate sovereign doctrine. Double jeopardy prevents the same government from prosecuting an individual twice for the same offense. However, under this doctrine, the U.S. federal government and the Indonesian government are considered two separate sovereign entities.
Two different governments.
Exactly. And furthermore, the U.S. federal charges were carefully framed as conspiracy to kill a U.S. national, focusing on the planning and plotting that occurred within the United States, rather than the act of murder itself, which was adjudicated in Bali.
That makes sense. The U.S. focused on the agreement and the intent formed here, not the physical act over there.
Precisely. This legal maneuvering allowed the U.S. to pursue justice based on the fact that the victim was an American citizen and the criminal agreement originated within U.S. jurisdiction. It completely circumvented any double jeopardy claim Mack might have otherwise raised.
The U.S. federal case finally moved toward sentencing several years after her return. What was the final plea agreement?
In June 2023, Mack pleaded guilty to 1 count of conspiring to kill a U.S. national. Under the terms of the plea agreement she accepted, she faced a maximum of 28 years in federal prison. This guaranteed a much lengthier sentence than the one imposed by the Indonesian court.
And the final sentence was delivered in January of this year.
On January 17, 2024, Heather Mack was sentenced to 26 years in prison. If you look at the total time, she received a very substantial sentence, a sentence designed to reflect the severity of the conspiracy and the financial motivation that underpinned the murder. It demonstrates a clear difference in legal philosophy from the Indonesian court that prioritized the mitigating factor of her child.
And where is she currently serving that time?
The sources confirm she is currently imprisoned at the Federal Correctional Institution, Hazleton, in West Virginia, serving her 26-year term.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This case represents a profound legal convergence. We had the conviction in Indonesia focusing on the act of murder, which was mitigated by the birth of her daughter, followed by a subsequent lengthy conviction in the United States, focusing purely on the prior conspiracy and financial motive.
It highlights a critical legal point for you, the listener. The rare event of a foreign murder leading to successful convictions under both international jurisdiction and U.S. federal law for conspiracy to kill a U.S. national. And this was all made possible by the separate sovereign doctrine. The 26-year U.S. sentence was substantially longer than the original Indonesian verdict of 10 years. It dramatically demonstrates the powerful reach of federal conspiracy laws in ensuring accountability for crimes against American citizens, even when the crime has already been adjudicated overseas.
And the sources, specifically those police records detailing 86 calls over 9 years, they force us to step back and look at this tragedy not just as an international crime, but as the culmination of long-standing domestic violence and trauma that the system repeatedly failed to contain.
Absolutely. The grim details we reviewed, the documented instances of physical abuse, the theft, the control tactics, the overriding of the father's will, and the intense disagreement over the pregnancy, they illustrate a painful, continuous history between mother and daughter. We report the facts from the sources, illustrating that this is not a crime born in a vacuum, but the catastrophic endpoint of a decade of documented, dangerous conflict. A conflict that ended with the horrific events in Bali, fueled by a dangerous mixture of resentment and, financial greed.
This whole case involves high finance, family tragedy, international law, and complex legal maneuvering across 2 continents.
The complex intersection of family relationships, documented domestic violence, financial incentive, and the pursuit of international justice is really the defining feature of this narrative. The events surrounding that $1.6 million trust fund, including the administrator's concern about possible bribery, and the final successful legal strategy that diverted the assets entirely to the victim's granddaughter. It all shows just how relentlessly the financial element drove every single aspect of this case, from the motive to the final resolution of the estate.
Consider the power of U.S. federal conspiracy charges to pursue justice and ensure a long sentence, even when a crime has already been adjudicated overseas. And the way the family's long history of conflict and financial strategy was ultimately scrutinized in courts across 2 fundamentally different justice systems. This case serves as a sober reminder of how deeply domestic dysfunction can spread and how global the reach of federal law can be.
And we leave you with this final thought. The fact that the conspiracy charge could successfully result in a sentence 2.5 times longer than the original murder conviction, despite the unique mitigating circumstances accepted by the Indonesian court, it raises questions about how different justice systems prioritize either rehabilitation and mercy or accountability and punishment in cases involving long histories of family violence.